Uh, Good afternoon, and here is then the second part of the class on James Cook's second expedition. And in the first one, I looked at some general questions of why a second expedition, the importance of trying to continue to discover this potential southern continent, and otherwise to make sure that the British were the first in with the possibility of trade and or domination of the different islands he was likely to come across. And I also spoke of some of the competition from France and Spain in particular. I also looked at the instructions which had been given to him for the second expedition by the Admiralty. So just to go through briefly the order of where he went. It's July 1772 when the two ships leave Plymouth, round South Africa. In December 1772, they get to the edge of the ice sheet and indeed cross the Antarctic Circle in January 1773. The Adventure goes to Tasmania, and the Resolution to New Zealand, because in February 1773 the two ships lost contact with each other, and we'll come back to that. They find each other again in May 1773, and off they go to Tahiti and then to Tonga, which they call at the time the Friendly Islands. The ships are separated again in October 1773, and they will not find each other again until they are back in England. The Resolution then goes off towards Easter Island, Tahiti, Namuka, and back in Britain in July 1774, whereas Cook and the Adventure take much longer. They take a year longer on their voyage, and they go via the New Hebrides, which is now Vanuatu, New Caledonia, New Zealand, and round the bottom of South America. And they will sight what they named the South Sandwich Islands before arriving back in Portsmouth, England in July 1775. I just want to really today go through just in order, some of the events of the second expedition and some of my reflections on them. I mean, because it's obviously very important to have the facts, but also the interpretations of the facts. And so, for example, the fact that the two ships lose each other twice is tremendously important, because it shows that the best navigators around at the time were still incapable of knowing exactly where they were, or sometimes even approximately where they were. The entire expedition even put to one side the meetings with local peoples who might or might not be pleased to see them. The entire expedition is extremely dangerous, and perhaps the most surprising thing about it is that it's not that Cook was killed in the third expedition, but that he managed to get that far at all. So, to go back to the beginning of the second expedition, Cook heads south and goes to the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape of Good Hope then in South Africa, and this is dominated at the time. It's a Dutch colony, and the Dutch governor has received instructions from Holland to treat Captain Cook's expedition fairly well. So you see that we have both international competition going on, but also international cooperation. It takes them 3 weeks or so to stock up the ships. It takes a long time to stock up the ships. And they take the opportunity while they're in South Africa, or rather at that point in the journal, page 232, Cook goes through a quite detailed comparison of the watches of the chronometers that he is carrying. We also notice at this point that the ship has 15 guns, so these are quite heavily armed ships. And he also goes into some detail about the food that they're getting on board. It was partly because this is a question of life and death, but it is true that Captain Cook does regularly mention what the crew are eating, and so it doesn't. It's probably not unreasonable to consider that he was somebody who cared about his crew. Now, this, of course, has been used by the hagiographers to show that he was some wonderful person. But of course, if you don't care about your crew, your entire voyage can fail, and everybody can die. So they then head south, even further south, and just to give you an idea of how far you can get in this sort of ship, some days they sail 80 miles, and some days they sail 30 miles. Remember that 50 miles is 80 kilometers, and remember, of course, that 1,760 yards is a mile, 3 feet is a yard, 12 inches is a foot, and so on. I'm sure you know all that. Cook describes the immense fields of ice which they come across, which of course no European is used to, and they get to see penguins and whales as they follow the edge of the ice and through a terrible amount of fog and of course cold. We see on page 240 that Cook reacts to the cold by making sure that the crew are able to handle it, and he says, "I set all the tailors to work to lengthen the sleeves of the seamen's jackets and to make caps to shelter them from the severity of the weather, having ordered a quantity of red baize to be converted for that purpose." Okay, so we see the DIY methods coming into account there. Suddenly it's extremely cold, so we're going to make some new clothes. While they are sailing south or around the ice anyway, they arrive to Christmas Day, and there's a little quotation there in 241 which says that the people were at noon, seeing that the people were inclinable to celebrate Christmas Day in their own way, I brought the ships under a very snug sail, lest I should be surprised with a gale wind with a drunken crew. So here we see how normal it would be considered to have the entire crew extremely drunk, and this is not something which Cook can consider that he can do something about. He simply has to react to the fact that they will all be drunk on Christmas Day, because that's accepted behaviour. Interestingly enough, when they did the documentary program where they sailed the replica ship a few years ago, 20 years ago, around the same route which Cook had taken, they didn't allow any of the crew to drink any alcohol while they were at sea. And of course not smoke either. So we can see that health and safety are things which are completely different in the 20th and 21st century. Cook describes the penguins and the albatross and the seals that they saw. And they also take the opportunity, now we're page 243, seeing that the moon is easily visible, they calculate the longitude using the lunar method. I will come back to the lunar method. They measured it as 9 degrees and 34.5 minutes east. And now he mentions that they take 12 observations and take the mean, or probably, as we would say popularly, the average. And so you can see that it is a quite... an unwieldy way of calculating, and obviously quite approximate if you take 12 measurements and then you take the mean. And he also gives the longitude as calculated by Mr. Kendall's watch. Not the same at all. By the moon it was 9 degrees 34.5 minutes, and by the watch it was 10 degrees 6 minutes. Well, we say by the moon. Of course, this depends how good they are at measuring it and sighting it, and with the different instruments they have. Mr. Kendall's watch is K1, and K1 is a copy of H4. I think I mentioned this in a previous class, Harrison was the great watchmaker who made these accurate watches by completely reinventing how a watch worked, in fact. That is, of course, the pendulum clock is of little use at sea. So he invented ways of using springs and bimetallic strips and sometimes wood as well in order to find a better timekeeper, of which the specific intention was to allow them to measure longitude more accurately at sea and therefore save thousands and thousands of lives, because the number of ships that simply banged into islands and all died was very high in the 18th century. And so Harrison, responding to the Longitude Act and the establishment of a prize for solving this problem, set to work and spent his entire life really producing H1, H2, H3 and H4, which you can see in the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. These were extremely expensive. They took many years to make. And then they had to, if you wanted to use them, you had to either take the original or make a copy. And of course, there were very few people who were even capable of making a copy. I'm sure that if I gave you a mechanical watch and a pile of metal, you wouldn't make a very good copy at any speed. So they are incredibly expensive. Indeed, some sources say that H4 cost a third of the price of the ship. Yeah, so that is an incredibly expensive, but incredibly valuable, because you're talking about saving very large numbers of lives. So that was K1 that they were using there for the measurements. The next thing they do is they try to renew their fresh water. It's been a long time since they were on land, and so they decide to try to use the ice, and they hoisted up ice which yielded about 15 tons of fresh water. And finally, on page 247, he points out that we completed our water to 40 tons. So I checked this out. It seemed an enormous amount of water to be carrying. 1 ton is about 64 gallons, and so 40 tons is about 21,000 pints of fresh water. And so this could well be correct. I imagine this is correct, because we looked at how many people there were. So that would be about 200. Yeah, about 200 pints per person. And you imagine that if you want to survive for several weeks, then 200 pints is not ridiculous. And indeed, he points out that now they say that they have enough water, and he says the people have had an opportunity to wash and dry the linen, etc., a thing that was not a little wanting. So when they don't have enough fresh water, then they're not washing their sheets and towels and clothes and so on. And so there they are allowed to wash them. And you can imagine that they are not particularly clean most of this time. You will notice here and indeed elsewhere that Cook very frequently uses the word "the people" to refer to the crew for his underlings. Now, I haven't been able to research how common the use of people in this way was in the Navy and indeed the 18th century, but it certainly is a word which sounds rather aristocratic. Yeah, the officers and the people, and so it's just another sign of the very strict hierarchy which was the normal thing in 18th century society. They eventually were unable to continue further south because of the ice, and indeed we later found out that when Cook was stopped by the ice, he was only 75 miles from Antarctica. So Antarctica, a real southern continent, but not at all, of course, the kind of southern continent that the British were hoping to find. They were hoping to find it full of gold and peoples who had valuable things to trade. They worked hard to find then Cape Circumcision, which I mentioned in the last class. They were not able to find it because, in fact, it had been marked with the wrong coordinates. And this is the point where they lose. Then we must be by now, I suppose, in February 1773. This is the point where the two ships lose each other for the first time. In an attempt to find the other ship in the fog, they fire a gun every half hour, but this is not successful, and so they just continue on their way through the huge icebergs, and the crew suffering very much from the cold, and also the animals, because they had a pig on board, which gave birth to 9 pigs, all of which were dead of cold within the day. So at this point, they decide to head for, they can't go any further south, and they decide to head for either New Holland or New Zealand. I'm sure you remember that New Holland is what we today call Australia. And one of the things they want to find out is if Van Diemen's Land is part of New Holland, or as we would say today, they want to find out if Tasmania is attached to Australia, which it is not. They finally find New Zealand, and they anchor in New Zealand after 117 days at sea. So 117 days at sea. What is left for them to eat? Very often food which is no longer very pleasant, and so of course they are happy to be able to organise some fishing on arrival. They have some contact with the local people, then with the local Maori people, and they see 8 of them. And interestingly enough, how Cook expresses this in page 262. One small double canoe in which there were 8 of the natives appeared again and came within musket shot of the ship. The muskets involved, of course, are not the ones that the natives have, which they do not, but the ones which Cook and his men have. So they work hard at the repair of different aspects of the ship, and also the general activity of naming. So on page 264 we learn, we shot 14 ducks, so I named it Duck Cove. And I think I have already perhaps officially mentioned the in what many people would call symbolic violence involved in naming people's places like that. They meet with the natives, exchanging gifts, and find that the Indians, as they call them, are only interested in hatchets and nails. That is, they're only interested in metal objects, which are so tremendously useful. And just to remind you, these are enormous nails, which can be the size of your forearm. Going to the housing of the local peoples, they are unimpressed. Low, wretched huts made of the bark of trees is what Cook calls them. However, the food is considerably better. When they go out hunting and immediately catch 14 seals, they're going to have a better time here. And they stay in this part of New Zealand for an entire month. And so obviously that gives them time to have a whole series of experiences. This is New Zealand, where they have been before in the first voyage. Cook expresses disappointment because there is a problem with some of the animals he brought. Indeed, he says, last night the ewe and the ram died, thus all my fine hopes of stocking this country with a breed of sheep were blasted in a moment. Now, I personally don't know how practical the idea of populating New Zealand, starting with just 1 sheep and 1 ram, is, but certainly that was part of his view of the world, that he wanted to be able to populate with the familiar animals. These far-off lands He never says, he rarely says directly that the aim of this is for the British to colonize, but that could certainly be one of the things. He's very surprised that the locals all ask to see Tupaya, Tupaya being the gentleman from Tahiti or around there who had visited New Zealand on the first voyage. And was able to talk to the locals because of the similarity of Tahitian languages and Maori languages. And obviously, he has become quite a celebrity locally. I don't know a lot of details of this, but I certainly know that in some Maori communities in New Zealand, the visit is considered to be Tupaya's visit. The first expedition. It may well be that the role of Tupaya is exaggerated to compensate somewhat for the mistreatment of the Maori people in this entire history, but that's one of the ways it can be looked at it. Cook is pleased by some aspects of what he has left in New Zealand, and he insists that the natives, 272, the natives were not displeased with the plantings of potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips. Yeah, so he's brought the root vegetables from Britain, and of course some of those didn't come from Britain. Potatoes came from South America, of course, and so he's encouraging and developing the globalization of vegetable lands. And they also work hard at this. They planted wheat and peas and carrots and parsnips and strawberries on one of the islands not far from when they were staying. And they also landed a pair of goats and a pair of hogs to breed in the wild. I mean, when we get to look in more detail at the ship, you'll realize that these animals must have been kept in extremely confined conditions. They were just like piled up on top of each other. The trade began between the crew of Cook's ship and the locals, and indeed it seems that as the comment of Cook is, it was not possible to hinder the former, his crew, from giving the clothes from off their backs for the merest trifle. Now, we don't have, there's a lot of information we don't have, but there is some suggestion that the crew were very eager to collect things because they could sell them when they got back, if they got back to England, when they got back to England, that they could sell exotic items for quite a good price. Cook comments on some of the surprising for him aspects of local society. For example, the women of the Maori women were also carrying arms just like the men, which was something which was which we might find less surprising today, but which, of course, for an 18th century gentleman was something quite shocking. The following day was the King's birthday, the King of England's birthday, and so there was a distribution of extra rum, a ration of rum every morning, but extra rum, seeing it was the King's birthday. The decision is then made to go to Tahiti and then return to New Zealand. Tahiti doesn't look too far on the map. It's actually 5,000 kilometers northeast. So we're talking about traveling 5,000 kilometers in a sailing ship and then back. So that's 10,000 kilometers. In this section, we have some of Cook's reflections on the effect that European visits might have on local people. And these reflections can be rather contradictory, that sometimes he may suggest that the European visits will have a negative view, and at the same time be convinced that what he is bringing, sheep and goats and potatoes and Britishness, are beneficial. So there's no, it's not worrying that the declarations may be contradictory. People contradict themselves all the time. Here the quotation, which is very well known, is he worries that the visit may disturb that happy tranquility they and their forefathers had enjoyed. And, says Cook, if anybody denies the truth of this assertion, let him tell me what the natives of the whole extent of America have gained by the commerce they have had with Europeans. So we have this, as I say, rather contradictory situation where he's reflecting from time to time on how terrible European arrival has been for the Native Americans, and yet his whole job is to encourage the extension of European influence and domination. They are having a number of difficulties at this point with the chronometers. The Arnold watch is broken and another one is broken. Two of them are broken. So I remember I told you how expensive they were. So obviously this is very, very disappointing. In any case, they arrive in Tahiti, almost lose the ships again. Or indeed almost sink. There is also here quite a technical piece about the ways that you can use anchors. Now, I'm sure you are like me that you can't really use anchors for anything at all, but there are different kinds of anchors for different surfaces and so on. It's a highly technical job. In Tahiti, they found that the locals were constantly asking after Joseph Banks, who of course was there with them in the first and was more of a sociable and charming sort, and less of a military person than Cook was. They meet up with the chiefs. And we can see here that Cook does learn a certain number of Tahitian words. He talks of the word tiyu, which he translates as friendship. He is again surprised that the king, as he calls him, quite often the attribution of hierarchical positions by Cook are ill-informed, but that the king, as he calls him, is asking after Tupaya. And the other gentleman, even though the king had not necessarily met them the time before. In any case, they gave the king a pair of goats as a present, and they discovered that the king loved the playing of bagpipes, the wonderful Scottish bagpipes. Interesting. Then I can imagine that the crew might have a number of musical instruments to keep them amused in the long evenings. And there is on page 286 then a description of the Tahitians dancing with the sailors, dancing country dances and dancing the hornpipe, which is a particular dance well known among sailors. This musical activity and musical entertainment is not all one way, because Cook is invited to watch a local Tahitian musical play, which of course they do not understand because of the language, but it appears to present contemporaneous events, indeed that the arrival of Cook is part of the play. And so we have here a fascinating example of how local cultures create culture, topical culture in a way that of course we're used to in urbanized societies, but which Cook was surprised to see in this context. And quite neatly, that's more or less what I have to say about the details of the second voyage. And very shortly, probably in 2 days' time, I will produce something else, which might be the third voyage, or about the science, or about the ship itself. So those are basically the different things I want to look at. So goodbye for now, and take care of yourselves, and stay at home.